Hello and welcome to the Climate Overshoot Commission's high-level virtual event on trade to reduce risks and the risks of climate overshoot. My name is Louise Mabula. I'm an entrepreneur, a UN Young Champion of the Earth, and most especially a youth member of the Climate Overshoot Commission's Youth Engagement Group, and I will be your moderator for today. So the Climate Overshoot Commission was convened as an independent body of eminent global leaders to propose strategies to mitigate the risks should global warming exceed the 1.5 degree centigrade target. It is the first high-level group to holistically address all approaches: emissions reduction, carbon removals, adaptation, solar radiation modification, in a comprehensive strategy, unfettered by typical political constraints. Our members include former heads of government, national ministers, directors of intergovernmental organizations, environmental group leaders, academic experts, and bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise. And we've recently published our report on the climate overshoot, including our CARE agenda, guided by distinguished international scientists specializing in climate change and Earth systems, ensuring that these recommendations are rooted in the most recent scientific evidence. Now, today's event will explore the risk of climate overshoot, that is exceeding the Paris Agreement's goal on limiting average global warming to 1.5 degrees, and to address the risks of these overshoot in an enabling environment that is necessary to facilitate the achievement of ambitious emission reduction goals by all countries. So the shift towards a net zero emissions economy presents challenges and opportunities for global trade specifically. For instance, national climate policies have trade implications. Insufficient clarity on the comparability and compatibility of different national level policies that will generate trade frictions and may impede the pursuit of more aggressive emissions reductions at the national level. And also, putting a price on carbon in one jurisdiction may lead to carbon leakage when business transfer production to jurisdictions with laxer emissions creates constraint or put local producers at a disadvantage compared with producers elsewhere who are not subject to such a price. So there are efforts to tackle these problems, such as the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanisms of the European Union, and perhaps it could exacerbate trade frictions in other trade partners. Alternatively, clean energy tax, such as those provided by the US Inflation Reduction Act, may put ineligible foreign producers at a competitive disadvantage, leading to trade tensions. So this virtual event will holistically discuss the climate impacts on trade, but also the trade mechanisms to support the global response to warming and reduce the risks related to overshoot. It will discuss how trade regulations can indeed serve as powerful tools in advancing the shift to a low carbon economy and in advancing the shift towards non-tariff measures as significant instruments for countries striving to address environmental and climate change concerns and ensuring equitable market access for developing countries, of which may be introduced into their NDCs. Now, the event will also discuss how climate overshoot is set to impact production and distribution patterns, while decarbonization of supply chains necessitates significant reductions in emissions associated with trade goods and services. Now, I am joined by a stellar group of speakers, and it is my honor to introduce, of course, our commissioner, Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization and the chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission, Mr. Aiko Lim, Director of Trade and Environmental Division at the World Trade Organization, Ms. Kumi Kitamori, Deputy Director of the Environment Directorate of the OECD, and Dr. Carolyn Deer-Birkbeck, Founder and Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. Now, thank you so much for all being here and for taking the time today to speak on this panel. And to begin, I wanted to direct my first question to Commissioner Lamy. It is quite surprising. I know that we've worked very tirelessly on the report, but taking into account your strong trade expertise and legacy, the Climate Overshoot Commission's CARE agenda and recommendations did not quite include or discuss specific trade solutions to address overshoot. So why weren't those linkages explored more explicitly? And maybe you could share a little bit more with us about these discussions and how they came.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks for convening so many friends around this screen. You're right in some proportion in saying that the Climate Overshoot Commission report does not front-load trade as a major issue. Although we did work on one specific aspect of trade, which you've already mentioned. Now, the reason why we did not dwell into specific trade policies and trade development is that we had other priorities. The mandate of the Commission was to make new, fresh proposals across the board in relooking at cutting emissions, adaptation, carbon capture, and even geoengineering, hence this CARE agenda, cut, adapt, remove, explore. And we started from the assumption that we know roughly the general relationship between trade and climate, and notably carbon or greenhouse gases emissions. It is both positive or negative depending on the angle. It is positive because trade as a transmission belt between supply and demand is a very efficient tool to increase the efficiencies of international division of labor. Hence, in some cases, allowing production to take place where natural resources are abundant, or the production can happen with less externalities. But on the other side, it also has a negative impact. For instance, in measuring the amount of environment externalities generated by transport systems. By the way, not so much shipping, although shipping does emit some greenhouse gases, but more generally, the surrounding of shipping in transport systems. Now, where, and that's my precise answer to your question, where we devoted some attention to trade is in looking at the friction, and notably trade friction, stemming from the fact that decarbonation instrument policies trajectories are dissimilar. The Paris Agreement disposes that roughly each country decides when, how, what speed, what instruments to decarbonize the economy, and this results in a large heterogeneity in the way countries do it, which generate trade frictions. We've had several cases of that, and we discussed that among the members of the Commission and with the youth group. You already mentioned the climate-related trade measures taken by the European Union, carbon border adjustment, deforestation directive, corporate sustainability directive. We've already mentioned what happened with the US, with the IRA, which is a huge subsidy program, which obviously de-levels the trade playing field, including, by the way, in providing subsidies which are WTO non-compliant. So there is an issue there. And then there is another issue, which is the one on which we focused, which is whatever frictions happen between big shots and industrialized countries, these climate-related trade measures have a strong impact on the trade of developing countries, non-industrialized countries, and this is a big problem. As you know, the Commission was composed of a majority of people coming from the South, for once, and that's one of the originalities of this Commission. And the reality is that many members of the Commission coming from the South criticized the fact that they are just on the receiving end of measures which are understandable. The reason why EU created CBAM is to avoid carbon leakages, but these measures do not take enough into account the development dimension of the problem, And this is where we made a few recommendations. The main one being that the WTO should be given a mandate by its member to look deeply into these issues and to look whether these trade measures are compatible, and at some stage move to another question, whether they are deemed compliant with the disciplines of the World Trade System. And this is, for the moment, unclear. Just look, for instance, at the recent dispute adjudication between EU and Malaysia on palm oil. The EU took trade measures that Malaysia deemed discriminatory against its production of palm oil, and the dispute settlement system established the fact that the EU was not faulty in principle to do that, but that the way they did it needed to be corrected. So there's a nest of issues there, which is the one to which we've pointed. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Commissioner Lamy. That's very interesting because you brought some points on issues on tensions around trade and data measurements and development and trade measures. And I think that really segs well over to Ms. Kumi on how can we achieve international consensus on the definition of green trade to help address climate overshoot, and doing that by facilitating more accurate measurement and promotion of sustainable trade practices, which influence the flow of energy-intensive consumption of goods and environmentally friendly capital goods essential for reaching net zero emissions that we've just heard from Commissioner Lamy.
Well, thank you, Louise, and thanks for the invitation and thanks for that specific question. So, it's very timely that we are having this discussion today because, as we know, there's UNFCCC negotiations happening as we speak, this week, next week in Bonn, to prepare for Baku later this year. And as we hear, the impacts and the human and economic costs of climate change is just increasing by the week, by the day. We all need to, we don't need to repeat that. But then, so it's very clear we need to scale up and speed up more ambitious climate action globally together as a global community. And I think what we need to do that is we need to pull all the levers available to all of us, all countries, to make this happen much faster. And trade is indeed one of the probably most powerful levers of all the tools we have available in both achieving climate neutrality and also increasing the resilience of our economies to climate change. And trade can also help to accelerate the deployment of all the low carbon technologies that we need in all countries, developed and developing, to reduce the cost of transition and also to promote more economic diversification that we need. To maximize the potential of a global trade system to enable global decarbonization, it's important to remove barriers, of course, of trade in low carbon goods and services. And also, trade agreements must be aligned with international climate goals. A recent review that we did at OECD on regional trade agreement, we explored how they are incorporating specific provisions to address climate change. And in that review, we found that among 775 RTAs, or regional trade agreement, signed between 1947 and 2021, at least 212 included references to climate-related provisions, promotion of environmental goods and services, such as renewable energy technology, and also encouraging the phase-out of fossil fuel subsidies, another important lever that's available to policymakers, and also addressing deforestation, mentioned already by Pascal. Also, to take full advantage of this trade lever to achieve global, climate goals collectively, we must also better improve our understanding of what is green in, the goods that are being traded, and it's actually not a very easy task. So it opens a whole Pandora's box. Because with the growth of global value chains, this presents a new measurement challenging and also verifying and communicating carbon contents of traded goods and also production processes that go along with them. So to address this challenge, another work stream at the OECD now is a review of carbon intensity metrics. It's being done as part of our flagship initiative, Inclusive Framework on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, and our colleagues and friends from WTO are very much involved, including Mr. Lim on the call. And specifically, in this work, we are surveying carbon intensity measurement methodologies using sector and installation and product level data, and reviews of challenges faced by firms in collecting and verifying supply chain data, because we have to look at the whole chain. And these supply chains, as we know, goes beyond one jurisdiction for most products and in most sectors. And also looking at the role of government in supporting measurement and use of such carbon intensity metrics. And so this is work ongoing, but some initial takeaway from this work is that first, many of the use cases for carbon intensity metrics, such as developing, monitoring, and evaluating the impact of carbon emission reduction policies, demand more timely and granular data than what's available today. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And secondly, there's a clear trade-off between data accuracy and resources required to work on this. Primary data collected from firms and suppliers will generally yield the highest accuracy, but it's not always possible to collect them. And collection may require additional infrastructure capacity and cost to all parties involved. And also, finally, the private sector has, we've been talking to many sector associations, for example, especially in heavily carbon intensive and trade exposed sectors. They all highlight that the global fragmentation of such carbon intensity metrics that exist today are increasing compliance costs for their industry with diverging requirements, and that's potentially hindering the international trade and limiting the opportunity to benefit from economy of scale if we have a more integrated global markets. And for this reason, aligning carbon intensity metrics that are emerging in different fora, different countries, different sectors, and ensuring the interoperability between these different schemes is extremely important to support businesses to strive towards carbon neutrality. So, we look forward to be able to share more findings that emerge from this work that we are undertaking at the OECD. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kumi, for your response. It's really holistic. I think you mentioned a little bit about, removing barriers and using trade as a powerful lever for reaching climate mitigation. But you also had this final point about the interoperability for businesses and how it's going to be used on the ground. So I wanted to transition over to Mr. Aiko. How can the use of trade-related regulations, known as non-tariff measures, support domestic and international climate mitigation efforts? And what are the challenges associated with their disproportionate impact, specifically on developing and least developing countries, or even on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and maybe even women traders?
Thanks very much, Louise. A pleasure to join this panel, especially with my former Director General, Pascal Lamy, as well as good friends from the different organizations. On your question, maybe to start with trade-related regulations, non-tariff measures. I tend to think that we look at these issues the other way around, and we should look at it differently, basically. And what do I mean by that? I mean, essentially, governments have tools that they can use to address climate change. And those tools are basically either regulations or some sort of pricing policies or a hybrid of the two. They're typically done not necessarily with trade in mind. I mean, they are done to pursue a particular policy objective. But in an integrated global economy, whatever one government does will have an effect. And these effects become particularly clear when we look at trade in most cases. So it's really about regulations, and it's about the vast scope of regulations that we have today. And we will have more. And then what are the regulations for? And the clear, everyone has stressed this, the clear need for regulations and for measures, for policies to address climate change. And we have seen this at the WTO. We track what we call environmental notifications to the WTO, and this grows every year. And it's not a surprise because governments, members of the WTO, who are also the same governments in the UNFCCC process under the Paris Agreement, they are submitting their nationally determined contributions. Nationally determined contributions, if you break them down, are basically this combination of regulations and pricing policies. And that's where the challenge begins, as Pascal had already mentioned, and Kumi as well. As many governments pursue different regulations, different pricing policies, or the mix of the both, they have trade impacts. And that's where we get into this big category of so-called trade-related regulations or non-tariff measures. Non-tariff measures are huge because it means anything that is not a tariff, essentially. And so can they be used to address climate change mitigation effects? Clearly, yes, because, these are instruments that governments have, be it a regulation such as energy efficiency requirements or certain types of standards that are then translated into a technical regulation. Perhaps it's about driving down greenhouse gas emissions. It could be instruments such as carbon pricing, which is, an instrument that many governments are currently adopting. So they're out there, and then we will probably see more and more of them. And on the one hand, it's great to see that governments are taking action, that they are trying to operationalize, so to speak, their NDCs and their commitments under the Paris Agreement into things that will make a difference and that will move markets. There's also another set of instruments that are very much in the use today, which are subsidies. Subsidies are also a non-tariff measure. On the one hand, again, we hear from renewable energy sectors that they have said that they want a level playing field. They want subsidies. If subsidies are going to fossil fuel producers, then renewable energy producers also want these subsidies, for instance. So again, it's not the issue about whether you subsidize or don't subsidize. If subsidization can help push the green transition, of course, that's a good thing. But again, what we need to be mindful of are the impacts that come from subsidy measures, particularly if they are designed in such a way that have very strong impacts on, as you could say, maybe impact on all countries, but particularly challenges for developing countries and the least developed countries, and the small and medium-sized enterprises amongst them. And yes, there are specific effects that could affect women traders. At WTO, we have a program on trade and gender and on better understanding these linkages between trade and climate change, trade and environment, and trade more generally in terms of their effects on women. The question, I think, is about what do we do about this? How do we move forward? And here I think the basics are going to be about better understanding the instruments. So a lot of transparency, a lot of questions about what are these instruments and how are they being implemented. And that's the key, the implementation part. The methodologies behind the instruments, whether you're talking about carbon standard or whether you're talking about carbon price or even energy efficiency requirements. At the WTO, I am also responsible for a committee called Technical Barriers to Trade. And in that committee, if you just look at energy efficiency requirements, there's a multitude of them. So for traders or for enterprises, it's a challenge. If every country has its different energy efficiency requirement or different carbon standard methodology, and if that carbon standard methodology is then converted into a carbon price, the ability to comply with such a diverse range of instruments is a cost. And that will clearly have an impact on the ability to participate in global value chains. The other part of it is, apart from costs, is having the so-called quality infrastructure or climate infrastructure, if you want, to meet these new requirements, measurements on carbon standards, for instance. Not all countries have that infrastructure in place. So there's a bit of a question mark here about how do we enable countries to deal with these measures. And lastly, just to mention that, we think a lot needs to be done on this challenge of fragmentation. And there are instruments at the WTO that already exist. So there isn't a need to reinvent the wheel. There's a large number of WTO agreements that are horizontal in nature. Their main purpose is about reducing regulatory fragmentation, for instance, or ensuring that subsidies do not have excessive trade impacts and so forth. So it's about using these agreements. And then in addition to using these agreements, thinking about where the gaps are. And if there are gaps, it's the question to the WTO membership, to the governments, how do they address these gaps? And what type of further international cooperation is required to ensure that the trade regime and the climate regime are both in sync with each other? So let me stop on that question there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lim. And it's really kind of grounding it and bringing it from those high-level discussions and how it applies on the ground. And that transitions me over to Dr. Carolyn. Of course, we've heard about trade and business and governments, and I wanted to hear about more of how can academia and civil society groups enhance their role in the intersections of trade and climate policies by integrating these global conventions and the applicability of these global conventions with national and local development priorities, especially considering the diversity of challenges on the ground and the need for capacity building amongst these grassroots organizations.
Great. Thank you very much, Louise. It's really a pleasure to be here also with Pascal, Ho, and Kumi. So thank you for your question about the role of civil society and academia. It's a huge issue, but I think a good way to start is to reflect on the challenges and state of play we have currently in terms of approaches to trade and the climate crisis. So as the other speakers have noted, we tend to be debating and approaching the climate and trade agenda very much from a national, sometimes a regional perspective, but most often from a domestic perspective. And it means that we don't often give adequate consideration to the importance of international cooperation in order to generate action that is ambitious, but also fair and sustainable over the long term. We also tend to not give enough importance to the links between different areas of policymaking. So we can focus on the nexus of trade and climate, but it's also important to consider the nexus with finance, technology, and wider policies around sustainable development. We've also got a number of missing or neglected issues in the discussion. One of them is around the impacts of the climate crisis on trade and on resilience, particularly of the most vulnerable countries. Another example is we don't pay enough attention sometimes to the interconnectedness of the supply chains that are key to the climate transition. And we're also missing some perspectives, those of MSMEs, many of the smaller and medium-sized economies, and also of workers and those at the bottom of global supply chains relevant to the green transition. So the result of all of that is you have a lot of domestic measures, many very well-intentioned, but with potential for trade frictions and for fragmentation, and also to slow down the kind of cooperation that we need urgently for reaching climate goals and wider sustainable development priorities. And we have to always remember that these are long-term games. Climate crisis will not be solved in the next 3 to 5 years. So we need a trading system and a way of cooperating that can endure and be flexible and enable cooperation over the long term as well. So it's in that context that I think about what the role of civil society and academia can be. And I think a key challenge you've highlighted is that their role is to try and help governments look at ways of taking national and local actions that are informed by and consider international commitments and principles that are embodied in international law relevant to climate action. So in this regard, some key concepts that we think need to be front and center are the importance of international cooperation, of transparency and consultation, and also of equity and development. And this is important because all countries face these domestic political economy challenges when it comes to climate action, with a diversity of commercial and social interests to balance. So we think that academia and civil society have a key role in focusing discussions on these shared global public policy objectives and helping governments see the wider picture beyond some of those more commercial and geopolitical interests that can for various good reasons, drive some of the domestic and national policy debates. So just stepping back for a second, what do we know civil society can bring? They can bring pressure for action, pressure for justice, evidence of impacts from vulnerable groups and sectors. They can also bring a sustained a push for accountability of governments. On the side of academia, we know they play already a huge role in transparency efforts, often filling in gaps where governments fail, such as transparency around trade-related environmental measures, on fossil fuel subsidies, and so on. They can provide concrete policy options, impact assessments, innovative ideas. So they can inform the debate also with evidence from ground realities and local context. But the key for me is not that we just need more civil society in academia, it has to be for a purpose. And here I think we need to think about leveraging civil society networks and global networks of researchers and analysts from universities and think tanks all over the world for the purpose of generating more cross-national thinking about how we can promote ambitious, effective, and fair international cooperation. So they can have a key role in helping us break down those silos that I mentioned earlier. They can play a key role in supporting and catalyzing consultation and policy-making processes at the domestic level. We have them in some countries, but a vast range of countries are still struggling to develop trade-related strategies on climate. So civil society and academia have a key role to play in supporting governments in that regard. They can help governments understand the challenges and political economy strengths of their trading partners to help identify these opportunities for cooperation. They can sustain this sense of urgency. But a key thing is we can also build links between the sort of trade analysts and civil society community with the climate community. And that can really help us focus on what is required in different sectors, in energy, agriculture, heavy industry, transportation, to really make change and where the trade blockages and supply chain issues are that need to be addressed. And I think that they can play a key role in building cross-national coalitions that bring in the range of voices that are relevant. Here, I think a key is that we need to do more work to support voices from academia and research institutions in developing countries to be present and heard in these international discussions, and also from stakeholder organizations. But just to close, I thought it's useful to say there's good news on some of this. One piece of good news is the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate, which was launched last year, bringing together 62 trade ministers, has noted one of its founding principles is inclusivity. And here they talk about the importance of engaging ministries and relevant stakeholders from different regions and different levels of development and climate vulnerabilities in discussion on trade and climate. And they also talk about the importance of building partnerships with stakeholders. Alongside at the WTO, I think there's really been a significant evolution in the approach that many, I'd say a diversity of the organization's members see in the role of bringing expert voices and stakeholder voices to inform and support their discussions around issues of trade, sustainability, and climate. So you see that in new thematic sessions at the Committee on Trade and Environment, which Ho here, plays a lead role in supporting the work of that committee, and also in these structured discussions on trade and sustainability at the WTO, where they engage a range of experts and stakeholders on an ongoing basis to inform that work. So that's not, the end of the story, but I think it's a good sign that there's more recognition of the role that these experts and voices can play in supporting action on these discussions. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carolyn. And I really love how it's an optimistic link for trade and civil society and academia, and how that can cooperate with governments and all of these different agendas that come into play. Now, for the second round of questions, we're going to get a little bit more deep into the topic, but I would also appreciate a quick fire and precise responses so that we can also get into audience questions right after. But I wanted to go back to Ms. Kumi on how the economic fragmentation that we've discussed earlier in global trade, as evidenced by shifts in supply chains and regionalization and geopolitical strains, pose significant risks to both economic prosperity and international cooperation, particularly impacting the ability to address a pressing global challenge such as climate overshoot. And what role does transparent, predictable, and inclusive multilateral trading systems play in mitigating these risks and promoting development aspirations for low and middle income countries specifically?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And I think we are really getting to the crux of the matter here. Maybe I can start with the first part of your question. And as as governments are already facing this big challenge, and Caroline also said it's a lot of connecting the dots, different ministries. You mentioned trade and environment and climate community, but beyond also finance, budgets, etc., economy, planning. So it's really, a given country has to press all the buttons and policy levers, as I said, to better coordinate, to accelerate climate action. So policymakers are having to manage and navigate through this very complex shifting geopolitics, on top of the challenges we already have today, but we have even more now. And then supply chain fragmentation, disruption, etc. How to navigate all that to arrive at a globally integrated action on climate. At the very beginning, Pascal mentioned the asymmetry and fragmentation or diversity in domestic climate action, and this is by design. It's in the spirit of Paris Agreement, because it's meant to be bottom up, and each country is starting from a different starting point, national circumstances, economic profile, emission profile, resource endowment, etc. So that's all fine, because this allows countries to adapt approaches that fit them best. And then this diversity in national approaches, which are in effect a combination of sticks and carrots. I mean, Ho also mentioned the subsidies and pricing, etc. But it's basically a combination to different degrees of sticks or carrots, or their other approaches, information, instrument, etc. Now, so these diversity in domestic approaches have accompanying spillover effects beyond just climate policy. And then I think this is exactly where we need more international discourse or conversation to unpack these spillover effects of domestic climate policies. So to better understand these spillovers, and maybe in unpacking these spillover effects, maybe we can think about three dimensions. First, of economic spillover, right? And the differences in mitigation policies can affect relative costs and productivity, and in turn competitiveness of firms in different jurisdictions. That's already been said. But beyond that, that spill over to economic growth and also employment, jobs, etc. Certain sectors will prosper, others will maybe shrink. So there are all this other socioeconomic spillover. It's important to understand this and address this at the same time when we try to figure out what policy levers are needed to address concerns in certain quarters. Another one is the technology spillover. So stringent domestic policies can spur increased investment in clean techs in certain countries. And then this could, over a longer term, eventually decrease cost of meeting emission reduction goals. But then if that comes with diffusion of such technologies and speeding up of innovation in certain jurisdiction, could ideally diffuse to other jurisdiction if helped by, well, if not impeded by regulatory barriers. And then such positive spillover in technology could be supported by, for example, international climate finance, technology cooperation, etc., especially in less developed countries that may want to have access. And also, and again, the third element is clearly the emission-related spillover. Differences in mitigation policies can affect the geographical distribution of production related to cost and related to emissions. So this is a typical example. This is, the carbon leakage problem, right? So that's really at the heart of the issue. And then this is very much linked to the trade and climate linkages that we've been talking about. And then this undermines the overall effectiveness of mitigation efforts, because basically if you don't manage this properly, we are basically simply shifting emissions from one part of the globe to another. So, we need to see how we can address this in a globally coordinated way. And as some previous speakers already mentioned, there are some inspiring initiatives to tackle exactly this in an open, inclusive dialogue. We are doing this at the OECD in an inclusive framework forum on carbon mitigation approaches that I mentioned, but also elsewhere, for example, on the trade coalition of trade ministers on climate. As I mentioned, also need other policy communities. We also have a coalition of finance ministers on climate action, tax communities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, there's this connecting of dots and policy coherence through different policy community, starting with trade and climate. So I just stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Kumi. Now over to Dr. Carolyn. How is the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables reshaping patterns of comparative advantage in global trade? And what are the implications for countries with abundant renewable resources and access to critical minerals, particularly in the context of high cost of capital in developing nations and major initiatives by economies such as China, the EU, and the US? And I think that also ties in with the economic, technology, and emission spillover topic that we've just heard from.
Thank you, Louise. Another huge question. I think a key starting point here is we know the energy sector is critical for achieving the Paris Agreement goals. There was a call at COP29 to triple renewable energy capacities by 2030. The IEA reported last year that we had the highest growth of renewable capacity additions, increasing by almost 50% last year, but also reminded us this week that the world is off track to meet the tripling goal. We would only slightly more than double by 2030. So we've got a lot of work to do, and trade-related cooperation have a role to play in scaling up and speeding up that energy transition. But as you noted, Louise, the energy transition is reshaping the geography of energy production and trade and comparative advantages. So unlike the case of fossil fuels, solar, wind, and geothermal, for instance, are not geographically concentrated, but they're more widely spread. This means that many of the countries who missed out that fossil fuels advantage could potentially become winners with their abundant sunshine, wind and geothermal potential through both clean power generation and also export. There are new opportunities also associated with green hydrogen production that could benefit a wide range of countries. But to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies, the production of a wide spectrum of critical materials will also have to increase significantly. So we know that these include lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earths. They're vital for the production of electric vehicles and major renewables such as wind turbines and photovoltaics. But today, the production of those minerals is highly concentrated in a few countries, while several of those countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, really stand to benefit from their endowment of these resources. A key priority for them is to ensure that they're not locked at the bottom of energy supply chains, but they can be part of the refinement, processing, and manufacturing of these critical minerals and clean energy. So a key challenge for them is the high cost of capital, which could hamper early investments, and technology and infrastructure will also play a key role in shaping sustainable mining practices and solving some of the risks associated with expansion in critical mineral sourcing. There's also a key role for services here as well. Another aspect of this is the extent to which countries, and particularly developing countries, can take advantage of these new potential comparative advantages in the energy transition will be largely influenced by what major economies do and their policy developments. And here, particularly, we can think about the policy approaches taken by China, US, and the EU. So at present, China dominates supply chains for processing of raw materials into products needed for the energy transition. So realizing this high dependency on China, the US, EU, and other Western countries are mobilizing significant resources and policies to try and de-risk their supply chains and ensure they're not competitively disadvantaged. Almost every day we hear about new policies in this regard. And the challenge in this respect is that we can't afford for this to be seen as a zero-sum game and only through this mercantilist national policy lens. And there's a logic, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, for countries to be focused on how this can support their own industries, tied to local content and jobs. But the risk is this may slow the global diffusion and uptake of clean energy technologies, and it may also affect investment decisions at the expense of developing countries that might otherwise have had comparative advantages in this transition, and in particular because it can raise the relative cost of capital for those countries. So looking ahead, we think this highlights the need for cooperative frameworks and approaches on partnerships, policies that facilitate technology and knowledge diffusion, support responsible investment in sustainable and equitable energy transition. So here we have to focus on financial mechanisms that can reduce risk and cost of capital in developing countries, partnerships that incentivize not only extraction, but also technology diffusion and enabling countries to move up the value chains, and more collective action to enhance regulatory transparency, interoperability, and to minimize distortions and unnecessary restrictions on trade. At TESS, we think there's a key role for the multilateral system to play in this regard. It might sound unrealistic in the light of current geopolitical tensions, but we think we have to recognize that it's necessary, not least because no countries or even regions can be self-sufficient in this push for the energy transition.
Absolutely. So we're hearing a lot of ambition needs to be done. We've already had a lot of ambition accomplished, but still much more work. And that brings me to Mr. Lim, because we know that at the recent COP28, it held the first ever trade day during such a conference. And there were headlines on so many achievements and milestones, including the recognition that climate overshoot is looming, fossil fuel subsidy debates have begun, pledges for climate finance and the loss and damage fund, and the tripling of renewable energy generation in 6 years from now. But what was achieved that we know was specifically done for trade, and what must be agreed upon and debated in the intersection of trade and climate policies at the upcoming COP29 in Baku?
Thanks very much, Louise. No, indeed, as you said, there was many things happening at COP28, and I think one important thing that I should say at the outset is that of all the achievements that you mentioned, like fossil fuel subsidies, tripling of renewable energy generation, they're all intrinsically linked with trade. I mean, the massive reduction in the price of renewable energy generation equipment, solar panels, for instance, of some 80% over the last decade or so, is very much linked to trade. It's linked to trade basically because of the scaling up of the energy, solar energy market that has allowed a lot of this reduction in price. Fossil fuel subsidy reform is actually a debate that is very much ongoing in the WTO. We actually have a working group on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And as well as the questions on climate finance also have a trade finance related element. And I think that's what we tried to do at COP28, was to try to bring a better understanding of the intrinsic linkages between many of the discussions and many of the goals and priorities in the climate change conference with trade, and sometimes it's very much bread and butter trade issues. And we did two things that I think we were very happy with. One was to help the UAE COP28 presidency to have the first ever trade day at the climate change conference. And I think that trade day helped to put a spotlight on many of the things that we need to see much more at the center stage of climate discussions. And the other thing that we did do as well, if you don't mind some product placement, we did this publication, Trade Policies for Tools for Climate Action, in which we specified 10 particular trade policy tools that can help the achievement of climate goals. So I think, you know, I think we shouldn't be looking at this so much as what is trade doing, what is finance doing, what is some other sector doing. We should be looking at this as an integrated part of the solution to climate change, because unless we, and that's the conversation I think we're hearing from all the other panelists, is that unless we join all of these things together and see it as part of an integrated solution, we are not going to be able to address the climate change challenges. And more specifically on the trade side, you know, we think the agenda is actually very rich. If you look at the one on tripling of renewable energy generation, this morning at WTO, we just had a World Environment Day event on the transition to the clean energy transition. And part of that challenge of tripling renewable energy is about reducing costs, spreading investment, and connecting countries that are not currently in the global value chain of renewable energy generation. And the way you do it is basically through trade. And to make this much more clear to governments as well as to the private sector is, I think, a very important piece of the puzzle. And what must be agreed for at COP29 and what should we be hoping to get at COP29? I think it's more than symbolic, but we're very much keen that COP29 also has Trade Day. We have been speaking to the COP29 Azerbaijan presidency. They are seriously contemplating and looking at the program of the thematic days for COP29. And that's one of the things that we are asking. And I think it's not just us. I think there's also other organizations asking about this, about having, again, a thematic trade day at COP29. We also did something with the international organizations, which was UNCTAD, International Trade Center, the International Chamber of Commerce, which was to actually have a trade house. It's a pavilion, but I think it's a very important space where we could have these debates and these discussions about the trade interlinkages with climate discussions. And I think beyond these two things, what we need is actually action. I think a lot of our work, I mean, we are Secretariat, of course, but a lot of our work has been about setting up frameworks, setting up possible options, providing ideas on principles that could be taken. And what we need is actually action. We need the actions to be taken forward, and that can be combined again between the IOs, with the governments, with the private sector. And I think we've got a great opportunity at COP29 to build a bridge between COP29 to COP30, bringing more into perspective the positive contribution of trade to addressing climate mitigation and adaptation, and at the same time recognizing the need for just transition and all of the challenges that come with a fragmented response to climate mitigation. And here, another ask, and I'll stop here, is the connection between all the very good things that are already out there. Caroline mentioned Coalition for Trade Ministers for Climate, which is a great initiative that ministers are able to do this and to go forward with their coalition. It would be great to have that coalition also work and support other existing initiatives that are already out there, which are already happening. On the part of the WTO Secretariat, we were able to launch steel standards principles with the private sector involving some 45 standard setting organizations to try to reduce fragmentation in the measurement of carbon or embedded carbon in the production of steel, and to make this work much more coherent and in line with WTO principles for international standards formulation. So there are many of these initiatives. So to connect the practical initiative, the actions with some of the high-level political coalitions that we're seeing, I think could be a really interesting agenda for COP29 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lim. So my last question I'll direct to Commissioner Lamy is, how are the numerous climate mitigation policies such as net zero goals, supply chain due diligence obligations, and green subsidies reshaping global trade flows? And what are the implications of mechanisms like the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism and the EU corporate sustainability reporting directive on international trade? And do you think that these will ease or increase the North-South tensions?
Well, I mean, what we've just heard, which I think is pretty lightning on this complex topic. And I think we've just heard from people who really know what they're talking about, which on this topic of aligning trade and climate is not that frequent. I think it shows two things. And the first one is related to your question. We definitely need more coherence between climate governance on the one side and trade governance on the other side. There is, as of today, no mandated place or organization that the 200 sovereigns of this planet recognize as the proper forum. Now, my own view is that the WTO is the place because it's the most comprehensive. I believe the OECD can do, as always, a lot of extremely good work, not least because they have expertise resources with their vast budget, which the WTO does not have with its tiny budget. But still, this question remains open. And we all know, by the way, that even within the WTO, some members say that the WTO is the place to discuss that. And others say, no. WTO is about trade, it's not about climate, so it should be elsewhere. So this conundrum, this problem, needs to be fixed. And I think it should be fixed in promoting this alignment conversation in the first stage as a conversation, as an informal exchange, as a notifying, listening, discussing exercise without any prejudice to the negotiations of further discipline than the ones that exist in the WTO, and which, by the way, allow, I think, a number of adjudication to take place. So it's not that there is no principles, there are no disciplines that can be interpreted. So that's the first thing. Otherwise, we will assist to a multiplication of unilateral measures. CBAM is a unilateral measure. The IRA is a unilateral measure. Both of them have trade consequences, but they are not multilaterally determined. They belong to the climate governance part of the equation, which is with nationally determined contribution. Nationally determined, not multilaterally, nationally. Hence, the recourse to these unilateral measures. And I think this really should be addressed. The second thing I want to mention, because I think I need to pick on a number of things which Caroline absolutely rightly said. We should not only consider what happens between sovereigns. It matters for international discipline, but in this area, there is a large room for the engagement of businesses, civil society, big academic institutions. And those of us who attended Sharm el-Sheikh or Dubai know, I think, at least that's what I got from the time I spent there, that what happens, let's say, between three major shipping companies that decide together to invest in a decarbonation endeavor is probably more important for the climate than a few paragraphs in something which is discussed between diplomats. So I want to insist on this. Part of the solution lies at global governance institution, treaties, sovereigns discussing between themselves. But there's another part which I think is very promising, which is by other than diplomats, actors of international cooperation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Lamy. And this has been such an enriching discussion. I see we had a question from the audience, which I think has been addressed throughout our discussion already, but I want to just read it out to everyone in case anyone wants to pick up on and answer it. But it's, how can public-private partnerships be leveraged to address climate overshoot through trade, which I believe Dr. Caroline had answered already, and what measures can be taken to ensure that trade-driven economic benefits are equitably distributed to support climate adaptation, which I believe we heard from Mr. Lim and Ms. Kumi earlier in this discussion. But can I just say what nuance and insightful feedback I've heard from everyone today. Thank you so much to our speakers, Commissioner Lamy, to Mr. Lim, Ms. Kitamori, Dr. Dear Birkbeck, and of course to the Climate Overshoot Commission for all of your expertise today and for bearing with me on such deep and wide questions across trade with incredible and comprehensive answers. I walk away a little bit more optimistic to know that these gaps around trade are closing. We've already accomplished so much, and we still have a lot more to go on our agenda to achieve climate goals and integrate trade levers as a baseline for climate solutions. So thank you again for your time and expertise. And to everyone tuned in today, thank you for joining us on today's event on trade to reduce the risks of climate overshoot. And we trust to see you at future events here with the Climate Overshoot Commission. So this is your moderator, Louise Mabolo, signing off. Thank you very much.